Hello, and welcome to Tin Cup Theology. I'm Steve, and this is...
I'm Andrew.
We're just explaining to him what Tin Cup Theology is because we are having a discussion with our tin cups of coffee. We normally go through theology, but this is a very special occasion as Fellowship Bible Church is having our missions conference, and Andrew is our keynote speaker with our theme, Compassion, a Door to the Gospel. And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about that theme today, but we also wanted to introduce Andrew to you and his role at Biblical Ministries Worldwide. And so, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We're excited that you're here. We would like for you to introduce Biblical Ministries Worldwide to us for those who may be unfamiliar with the ministry.
Absolutely. Well, Biblical Ministries Worldwide is a faith-based, nonprofit, global mission organization. And the theme or the motto of the organization is Healthy Churches Everywhere. Now, what that means for us is that we work through local church-based communities to do all sorts of things that bring God's light and God's love to the world in a variety of ways. So that's everything from evangelistic outreach to traditional church growth and development to orphan care to humanitarian programs to radio services to all sorts of things that we're doing. And right now we're in almost 60 countries around the world with over 500 personnel based in those countries, and then thousands more in a network of local and national partnerships all over the world, based in Metro Atlanta. So it's good to be here.
Great. You know, Biblical Ministries is one among many missions organizations. What stands out for you about BMW?
Well, when I came to Biblical Ministries Worldwide as executive director, I was drawn to it because, well, two real reasons. And first reason, Steve, was that there was a quality in our personnel. So we have a very unique group of people who have a reputation for staying out there for many, many years and seeing our projects through to completion. We have a culture of staying however long it takes. And I really like that, because one of the worst things in global mission is to go in and leave too soon, or to start a thing and not finish a thing. So we're very strong in that. Secondly, I think we have a tremendous amount of flexibility within the guardrails of our organization, our mission statement, our doctrinal statement, our purpose statement. We are known for finding ways to do creative things and have a culture of innovation. And I love that about BMW. Oh. And of course that, my predecessor for many years, Paul Sager, who's, and a dear friend, really brought a healthy spirit of innovation to BMW, and I think we want to continue that. That's great. Yeah.
Thank you. If you don't know already, Andrew is the president of Biblical Ministries Worldwide, and it's been 3 years or so, 4 years?
And then my third year.
Year.
Just about to finish 3. So,
well, it's been very, very exciting.
I don't know if we count the pandemic years, because that's kind of its own thing. Yeah.
That might actually double, kind of like the life cycle of a dog. Right, that's 7 years to one.
I'd like to
just getting through the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. How do you see BMW moving forward as an agency?
Well, it's a good question. Steve, I think there's two ways to think about it. I think moving forward, so mission agencies are complex. And I would challenge anyone on that is to just do a thought exercise, close yourself in a room if you're interested in this question, and say, what is a mission agency? Just define it. And as you start to unpack that question, it's a lot harder than you might think at first go. We have something, I think, that really helps us stay true to our purpose, which is that the work we do is of, by, and through, and visibly worked out at the local level. So these local church communities are the end or the goal of the mission organization, to be visible, meaning we don't have to stamp our logo or our badge on things. If we can help the local church embedded in its own place, its own culture, its own country, and really see outcomes that further the gospel. Okay, that keeps us true to who we are. So I'd say the first answer to your question is keep doing what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In that way. I think the second answer is that we are walking, or maybe running as a world, into some uncharted waters. We've been in a period in the last 10 years of global uncertainty and rapid change. And, the pandemic accelerated that. Some of the financial crises and things we're seeing, inflation and certainly global conflicts, whether it's the Ukraine-Russia situation or whether the news out of Israel and Gaza and all of that this week. More of this is, I think, going to continue to happen. So I think part of the answer is positioning BMW to be able to react to global crisis. And we're in a reactionary time. It's like, are you proactive or reactive? Well, you can't be proactive to things you don't know are coming. And there are certain, I think there's something to say for being able to react well to crises. And I think we're developing a culture and a type of organization with our technology, with the way we operate, our structure, that we want to be positioned to react well and react quickly to maximize our goals, which is, again, healthy churches everywhere, furthering the gospel, reaching people where they are. So I think the quick, that's a long answer. The quick answer is keep doing what we've been doing, but also be an organization that can react in a time of crisis and actually see outcomes that are good at the ground level.
Oh, yeah, well, that's great. So it has something to do with the logo we have here on this bottle here, Healthy Churches Everywhere, and then recently under your administration, you came up with a ministry called Compassion Medical Worldwide, hence the back of my shirt.
Yeah,
and so tell us why Compassion Medical.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, Compassion Medical is a division of Biblical Ministries Worldwide, and it's a division that is meant to do several things. One is to give us a space in which we can work well in really difficult places. So we were very present in the Afghanistan crisis in 2021. And certainly been very present in Ukraine and present in other places where there's been conflict. We've done, we've been able to facilitate work in South Africa and West Africa through this ministry. Compassion Medical is a way that we can connect donors and relief to people directly on the ground. And it gives us a little bit of flexibility and freedom to do things that we can't otherwise do through other channels. And so I think the name says it all. It brings together two components: compassion, which is helping people with their real life needs, medical, helping people with medical and medical institutions. The goal of Compassion Medical is to be boots on the ground, visible, real life help for people who need it, and to provide Biblical Ministries Worldwide with a delivery system to be able to do this in an efficient way. And I think our Compassion Medical team's done a tremendous job with it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's the point.
Yeah.
That's. So.
Yeah, and we're going to have a upcoming podcast with the director of Compassion Medical.
Yeah.
And so look forward to that. As we talk about compassion, and this is a theology podcast.
There you go.
So connecting that, is there such a thing as a theology of compassion?
Well, I think there is. I think there should be. And I think there is historically in the church. I think that the church falls into a couple of pitfalls with this sometimes in the American context. I'm not sure that this is true in the global church. I think there are certain parts of the American church where there are fights about this. One of the great things about this work at BMW is we're not in those fights. We don't spend any time thinking about them. We see a very clear idea of Jesus and even the Old Testament in the Torah, the prophets, of a calling out to people of God to help those who need it and to stop corrupt actions which harm the weakest among us. It's a consistent thought that plays out all through the law, the prophets, and certainly you see this theme even picked up by James in the New Testament, putting real life actions to your faith. So saying, look, I can't be a true follower of Jesus if I ignore the needs of my brother and sister, or those weakest among us, if I participate in hurting them, if I participate in corruption, if I add weight to darkness and hurt the weakest in society. So I think there's always been a theology within the Christian church of tangible actions that make the community, the people, the neighborhood, the world around us better for those who are suffering. And I think the church has always had a voice in that. Whether it's, whether you think about the work of Wilberforce in, late 18th century, early 19th century Britain in stopping the slave trade, there were, there are just numerous examples of people saying, look, as Christian people, we need to be speaking up about this. We need to be taking tangible actions to make this stop, make this better. So that's an intro.
That's great. Yeah, mercy, justice,
sure,
which in and of itself is a reflection of the attributes of God, and so that's so it's sourced from Him.
Well,
itself.
Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? And you think about the implications of that, and I think where we find the good news to be good news is that the good news calls us out, but it also compels us. It calls us out in that no one can do justice 100% of the time. We don't, because of the world we're in, the way we live, we can't, in and of ourselves, be the source of justice in every action we take. In fact, in every case, in all of us, in some way, we're going to be a source of injustice. Mm-hmm. So even though it's like we want to seek justice, we want to do justice, we want to love mercy, all of us fail in those things. And so the good news is this extraordinary thing of forgiveness, which acknowledges our failures, that we can't actually be perfect sources of justice and mercy, but that in that we have received this forgiveness and freedom in the gospel, we then are free to seek those things and practice those things because we have a divine power that compels us to do it. And that's grace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
How does our Lord Jesus model for us compassion ministry?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting parallel in 3 chapters of John, and I mean you can probably extrapolate this all through the Gospel of John, but I find in John 4, 5, and 6 a really interesting 3 sets of stories that kind of illustrate how this may work itself out. Okay, so you've got the Samaritan woman in John 4, and you've got the invalid man at the pool in John 5, and then you've got the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6. And in all 3 of those stories, you have illustrations of what compassion ministry looks like in practice. So in John 4, Jesus crosses, you could say cultural type of, almost like racial, ethnic barriers, religious barriers, by reaching out to a woman who would be seen as less than a man, but then there's also the Jewish Samaritan clash. Mm-hmm. So he steps across that divide, goes to a place where it's uncomfortable. And I think that's the first step in any form of compassion ministry, is putting yourself into a context in which you're challenging yourself. You're challenging the things that you love and like. And so I think that's a powerful, yeah, sure. And yeah, so John 4 you see Jesus is, he's saying to the woman of Samaria, he says, "Give me a drink," in John 4 verse 7. And she's taken aback by that. And, well, why are you approaching me this way? And, we don't get along. I'm not fit to give you something to drink. This would be, I can't do that. So he gets to a level of equality with her. And so I think that's the first step in compassion, is crossing over that. John 5 is a completely different side of this, in which, and I told the folks this morning when we were talking out there, I said, when you look at John 5 verse 6, Jesus sees this man who's been laying there for 38 years by this pool seeking healing. And the story of the pool is, there's some kind of weird event that takes place according to the legend. And there's an angel that goes down in the water and stirs the water. And then it's really, there's a lot to unpack in that story, which, we don't have time for today. But the idea is, whatever's happening in that water, the guy can't get in the water because nobody's there to help him, and he's an invalid, and somebody rushes down and jumps in before he can get in the water. Well,
cutters.
Yeah, cut in line, right? Yeah. Always a problem.
Yeah.
So Jesus says, this guy who's been laying here for 38 years, it's the weirdest question. I think it's one of the strangest lines in the Bible. He says in John 5:6, do you want to be made well? Or do you want to be whole? Do you want to be healed? I think I saw that as an element of sarcasm for a long time, and I lived in England for a number of years, and of course nobody's better than the Brits at sarcasm. I picked up some of that, and thinking, yeah, I think I'd want to be healed. Why is he asking such an obvious question? And I think at second and third glance, as I ended up being more and more involved in kind of real life compassion ministry, and our church in London was in a very challenged area. There were a lot of social dysfunctions. There was a lot of crime. There was ethnic challenges as far as different groups not getting along with one another from different parts of the world. And living in that area and seeing the day-to-day trauma that people were living with, I think I started to understand this question better, and that not everybody actually wants to be better. Not everybody actually wants to be healed. And there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. And one of the things you find out when you do compassion work is you can't force anything on anybody. And I think there's sometimes people try to do that. So, I'm going to help you, and my help is exactly what you need, and you will receive it, and this is the way it's going to work out. You can't force that on anyone. And so I think there's a couple of principles. In John 4, it's you've got to cross a line you're not comfortable with. In John 5, you've got to reach people who want to be reached. And you've got to find them. Jesus does that here with this man. John 6, you leap ahead into John 6, and there's another story, and it's a famous story. It's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And there's this whole idea Jesus is teaching a big crowd of hungry people. And they're hungry because they've been out all day. And vast majority of these people don't understand the theology or the Christology of what Jesus is or represents. They're going along. They're along for the ride. They're along for the show. And they're hungry. And he feeds them. Now we know the story of the 5 loaves, the 2 fish. It's kind of it's a essential Christian miracle if you read it out. But I think deeper than that, there's this idea of, hey, these people are hungry, I will feed them. It's a sign. We know it as a sign, one of John's famous theological signs of who Jesus is, etc. But underneath that, there's a principle of they're hungry, they need food. And I think we sometimes overcomplicate the story. While there's certainly a sign there, there's also a practical reality of there's thousands of hungry people who need to eat, and he feeds them. So, 3 principles of compassion ministry. First, in John 4, you see crossing a line of discomfort, putting yourself in a place to help those that make you feel different, and you don't understand, and you cross over into their world and put yourself at that level to listen, to hear, but to elevate the conversation to something bigger than your culture and their culture. We're talking about the thing that brings us all together, which is the essential spiritual need of every soul. is to know God, to find God. John 5, you reach the people that want to be reached, but there's a danger there. As if you're saying, well, I'm going to go out as I do compassion work, and I'm going to discriminate against people who I'm not sure if they're really willing. And there's a real danger line there. The willing make themselves very obvious. But then there's another principle. Well, what if I have a big crowd of hungry people on my hands? What should I do in compassion ministry? Well, you feed them. Now, here's where all this adds up. And this is maybe the theology of compassion. There are people who think, well, I'm not going to do the feeding thing because I'm not sure that everybody there understands the Christian message and is receiving it. Yeah, but if you've got hungry people and you can feed them, you feed them. But in doing compassion ministry, as John 5 teaches us, you also reach those who are willing to be reached. And John 4, you could say, starts it all off with the essential cry of every soul, which is spiritual. And so John 4, you see the living water, and then John 5, you see the theme continuing, Jesus kind of explaining his identity, who he is, related to the Father. Search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. They testify of me. He links himself up in that vein with the divine that people are searching for. And then John 6, I am the bread of life. So there's a spiritual fundamental theme in all of it. But I think those three core principles get us, it ensures that we don't lose something essential in our compassion ministry. Because we have two extremes. Well, I only reach people with the spiritual need. I ignore the physical. Then you've got the other side of that is, I only do the physical, I don't bring any spiritual into it. But people, the whole point of being a human is that we're both spiritual and physical. And compassion ministry brings both of those things together. You can't do the spiritual if you're refusing to meet the physical, and to only meet the physical and to ignore the spiritual is to make a person less than they are.
Yeah.
It's to ignore the image of God in the person. And nobody really does that. No one actually really can do that without almost harming their own soul. Even in secular, humanitarian, entirely international organization type outreaches, if you're on the ground and you still watch the connections between international aid workers and people, emotional connections are still formed. Why? Because you're meeting people at their most baseline need of escaping terrorism, escaping violence, escaping natural disasters. And so as a person who is following God, how could you ignore that this person is a soul like you who needs to be connected to God? Yeah. So I think there's something of a sketch out of a theology there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry for being long-winded.
No. This is perfect because, on one hand, there are people who say the gospel ends with compassion. And then,
interesting, yeah.
When it's kind of the liberal agenda that doesn't get to the gospel. And then there's another extreme that you brought out where people only want to deal with the spiritual need and not the physical. And I think James opens our eyes that we really have to show that.
I've heard this and I've heard about these extremes, but what I've always found remarkable is I never see it work in practice.
Yeah.
You see, as you said, you see kind of the liberal theology of, well, we're not gonna bring the spiritual into it. The end result of that is something really bizarre, because no one can actually do that. You can't actually avoid the cry of the soul. And then you've got the other side of, well, and I see this sometimes in churches, you'll have pastors especially will say, well, we don't support ministries that do humanitarian work. And you'll get some of those on that extreme side of it saying that. What I found without exception, even in those church congregations, is they never practice that in their own church. If they have a needy church member, they help them.
Yeah.
if they, many of those churches will help out with the local food banks, or they will do like a Thanksgiving meal for the community. And so, or there's a fund, a benevolence fund within the church. So that never actually works itself out on a day-to-day level. But somehow it's almost like when we look at the world as a macro, it's like we draw these big lines and make big sweeping judgments. But I think that's the point why our motto is so essential, is healthy churches everywhere. The world is simply a collection of local church communities, local groups, in the Christian sense, working out these issues at the local level. Yeah. And so when you draw big sweeping lines, I don't think people always realize they're affecting hundreds and thousands of local church communities just like their own, that are perhaps dealing with things far more severe than what the average North American church deals with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I love those passages you chose, John 4, 5, and 6, because the water leads to a talk of the living water, sure, and the bread leads to a talk of the bread of life. And,
right.
And so it's and Jesus connected that with his own ministry, and so the physical to the spiritual, and ministered to both.
John 4:24, Jesus has just said to her, "Look, we're not going to have a religious argument. The time is coming when true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth, in the heart." And so worship and truth flow out of a connection to God from the heart. So all of that, what I think Jesus is doing here is he's elevating. He's using a physical thing, which everyone understands. I'm thirsty, or later in John 6, I'm hungry, to point out the spiritual cry. Yeah. And using those metaphors. But it doesn't undo the fact that we're still physical beings that need physical assistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, one final question for our listeners who are listening out there, individually in their car or on their computer. What's your challenge for the believer that's listening out there in the area of compassion?
Yeah, so I think there's a challenge would be to say this. Look, there is something here where you live in your area where there's maybe a place that you're afraid to go, a group of people that you're uncomfortable around. And I think the first step to true Christian compassion is to cross over that line, as we see in the story of Samaria, or the Samaritan woman, to cross into a place of discomfort, a culture clash, a place that you don't feel like you're around your own. Step out of that box and step into the other and say, I need to learn, I need to hear, I need to watch, I need to see, and I need to understand what's stopping me from helping and reaching. I think the church alive, the church empowered, the church going forward, and you see this in Acts as well, in the book of Acts, is a people that are willing to put God's kingdom, the Spirit of God, ahead of the walls that we build all over this world. So that's my challenge. Find a place and a people that make you uncomfortable and go there. And then find out what the needs are, and they're going to be very obvious. And discover the willingness. And when you see the willingness, you meet the need. You meet the need. And you meet the need without reservation, without expectation. You meet the need because the need needs to be met. And in doing so, by meeting the need, by being in the place, by connecting the Spirit of God to the needs of the people, you find out that God's love, God's light, God's truth begins to inhabit you in a new way, but it also begins to inhabit the people that you're talking to and working with. And that is how the church becomes visible. That's how people suddenly start to see, this isn't about walls. This is about God doing something inside of me that's changing me. And I think that's when you start to see, that's when you start to understand how God, in the message of Jesus, changes lives. by going to where those lives are. That's a hard process, though. So that's a challenge. I didn't say it was easy. Sounds easy in here. It's not easy in real life.
Right, yes.
It's very humbling. Very challenging.
Theory and practice are two different things.
Completely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, Pastor Steve, thank you.
Yeah, this is great. Well, thank you for listening to Tin Cup Theology. On behalf of Andrew and Steve, thank you.
Let's do that. There. Oh.
Oops. Goodbye.